Hare Krishna, everyone, and welcome to our second panel for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. During this campaign, the ISKCON Vaishnavi Ministry is hosting a series of discussions about identifying abuse within our ISKCON communities and how to address it. So today we are going to look at what domestic abuse is, the impact it has on our human and spiritual life, and the psychology of an abuser. And we're going to speak with Her Grace Citi-Śakti Devi Dasi and Her Grace Chaitanya-Lila Devi Dasi. So thank you very much for joining us today for this important conversation. Before we start, I would also like to introduce you a little bit more. So Her Grace Citi-Śakti Mataji has been practicing Krishna consciousness for over 25 years, and she is a disciple of His Holiness Bhakti Tirtha Swami. She lives in London, UK, and serves as a preacher, mentor, and leader. She is a trustee and director at the Bhaktivedanta Manor and for the Institute for Applied Spiritual Technology in Washington, D.C. She is also co-founder of MindSpace, a confidential mental health space for devotees in UK, which I think is great. She graduated from Imperial College as a medical doctor and specialized as a psychiatrist. She has been diagnosing and treating a wide range of mental health problems for over 20 years with medication, psychotherapy, nutrition, and Vedic teachings in an integrative model. She brings together 2 decades of experience in scientific advances in mental health with Krishna consciousness and connects with a diverse audience of celebrities, politicians, healthcare professionals, students, and corporate leaders. She regularly broadcasts for BBC Radio on current affairs, mental health, well-being, and spirituality with over 200 million listeners, and she presented her own show for 3 years. She features on TV and in a number of newspapers and magazines and has contributed to several books. So thank you very much for joining us. And now to introduce Chaitanya-Lila Devi Dasi. So Chaitanya-Lila Devi Dasi, she is born into Krishna consciousness, so she's a devotee since birth, which is wonderful. She works as a psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and trauma therapist, and she's currently working full-time as the head of mental health service at a UK university. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining. You're definitely professionals in your field, and it will be an honor for me to learn from you and to know more about our topic of domestic abuse. So we will first start with discussing what domestic abuse is and how to recognize it. And also we are going to talk about, as the topic suggested, what impact it has on our human and spiritual life. And also we are going to talk about the psychology of an abuser. So let's start with our first question. So I don't know, I will start with this time Citi-Śakti Mataji. So what is an abuse? And then Chaitanya-Lila can also contribute to the topic of what is abuse actually.
Okay, so we're speaking specifically about domestic abuse. Abuse, you know, in one sense, it's implied there's exploitation. And when people often think of domestic abuse, they think of violence straight away. That's where the mind goes. And so they look for symptoms of violence or expressions of violence or signs of violence. But actually, domestic abuse is an umbrella term, and it includes within it exploitation that takes place in an intimate, familial, or home environment. And it can, of course, extend out into institutional abuse. There's so many different types of abuse, but that exploitation can include financial, emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical abuse, and can also include neglect, not just exploitation. And when we're talking about familial environments, it can be spousal, it can be parent to child, it can be child to parent, it can be men to women and women to men. It's rare that somebody only experiences one type when it comes to domestic abuse. Where there's violence, there's usually emotional and psychological, and there may also be sexual and financial and vice versa. I mean, the combinations sadly are many. And actually, but Srila Prabhupada and Shastra speak very strongly against it, and maybe that's something we can get into in a few minutes.
Yeah. Chaitanya-Lila, Mataji, would you like to add something to your understanding of domestic abuse and your experience? I mean, it's clearly defined, but maybe you would like to add something.
I mean, I think, you know, that is the very specific definition, really, of domestic violence. I think, you know, I suppose the unconscious undercurrent at play with that definition is really the dynamic of power imbalance and the misuse of the power that can be formed in domestic violence situations and abusive situations in general. But yeah, it's a comprehensive definition that Citi-Shakti has given. So
I would like to just add to your explanations, like what is written in the ISKCON policy on domestic abuse. They have defined it like as coercive control, psychological or emotional abuse, physical or sexual abuse, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, using scripture to put down a spouse or a partner, financial or economic abuse, harassment and stalking, online or digital abuse. So really a wide spectrum of things. So yes, the other topic which we would like to address when talking about domestic abuse is like, what does Srila Prabhupada say about abuse, or what do Shastras say about abuse, from your experience as a devotee and practitioner, and also someone who reads the Shastras? Maybe Chaitanya-Lila, you can say.
I mean, I think, you know, I just want to kind of catch what you said there in the description in ISKCON's policy. Sorry, before we kind of move on to Prabhupada, because really, really detailed there, and it's so important. Each one of those, you know, have their own nuances, and every description there of abuse, there's a crossing of a boundary. And you know, that's really what abuse is. There's a crossing of a personal boundary, like harassment and stalking and the coercive control. There's a crossing over, using one's force to cross over into a boundary that one shouldn't be crossing. And so there's an intrusiveness that comes with abuse. And you know, I just want to sort of elaborate on a few of those things, because I think you reeled them off, and they're so important to kind of catch and understand that, you know, for victims of abuse to recognize, you know, what abusers do is that it is this intrusion of this boundary, and one feels that on an instinctual level, you know, even when it's physical and when it's mental, like with the coercive control. You know, when someone is manipulating and using things, using Shastra, you mentioned about using Shastra to put down someone. And so often one can recognize that by recognizing that there's a misuse of, there's a crossing over of personal space, psychologically and physically. And so that's what abusers do. And so just in that list that you gave, and there's so much more, so much that we could kind of expand on all of those things, I think. And so, you know, maybe we'll kind of expand on those things. I didn't want to, you know, kind of jump away from your question.
No, it's fine. I mean, I wanted to mention it because Citi-Shakti Mataji, she said that usually when people talk about domestic abuse, they only think about physical violence, but it's including so many other aspects, which Absolutely. This definition tries to also include. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. It doesn't just appear in physical bruises. It's, you know, the emotional impact, the manipulation, the verbal and psychological twisting of things. Yeah. Okay. That counts as
maybe before we start talking about what Prabhupada said and what Shastra said, maybe we can also address, like, what, in your opinion, why is it important that ISKCON talks about domestic abuse, like as a spiritual institution.
If you wanna start on that?
You're asking me why is it important we address it?
Yeah,
because you know, where there's exploitation of power, an imbalance of power, there's deep disrespect of somebody and or of many people, and it basically means there's a lack of love, because that relationship's often rooted in fear. And if it's happening in our communities, then it's going to rise up to the leaders, and if it's happening in leadership, it's going to filter down to the microcosm of community, which is family and couples. So it's not a one person problem. It's not even a couple's problem or a family's problem. It's not even just this organization's problem. Where there's one organization which tolerates or allows domestic abuse to continue, treating it as if it's a private issue and a personal issue, and people should be left to get on with it or deal with it themselves. That same consciousness we allow to emanate and radiate from our organization and also impact the rest of the world as almost as powerfully as we also facilitate for the rest of the world to also hear the glories of the holy name and the sound vibration of the holy name. But how much do we muddy that water when we then also allow the echoes of permitted domestic abuse to continue? So I think it's so important, but everybody's trying. I do have a genuine belief that most people are trying their best. And if there are mistakes being made, it's often because they're ignorant, they don't know, and they don't understand. Perhaps there isn't education there. So I'm really pleased we're doing this 4-part session, which addresses everything we possibly can in these 4 sessions, in raising awareness, in improving understanding, providing some tools to get help, and then looking at how we can make things better in the short, medium, and long term.
Thank you.
I think it's so important in ISKCON to add to what Chithi's saying. Sorry, because I know Citi-Shakti, I just call her Chithi, so please excuse me. It's kind of just a quick way of referring to you. I hope you don't mind. So I think it's so important in ISKCON because the Shastra and the philosophy talks about roles, gender roles, of women and men, children. You have the different categories of people and gender roles. And I think what happens in our spiritual society is that those philosophical points become weaponized and used to suppress certain individuals, used to abuse certain individuals, which then breeds the domestic violence that happens. So, you have the typical situation of a husband and a wife, right? And the Shastra talks about, women, the wife being submissive, the husband being, non-different to, Lord Vishnu, and so the Lord, and these principles in our philosophy get misused and get used as a weapon to then enforce and abuse. We're talking about women in this regard. So abuse these women who are expected to be servants of their husbands, and so that's where the problem lies. And it's not a problem necessarily. It's not a problem with the philosophy. And I think what happens as an offshoot of the abuse is a rise in feminism within ISKCON, which also isn't the solution, right? Because then you don't understand actually the true essence of the philosophy of what it means to have a role as a wife and a role of a husband. And maybe we can talk about what Prabhupada talked about with the women and men, and how he also treated his disciples, female and male. So because of this misuse and misunderstanding of the philosophy, we have this justification of the abuse, and a rise in this counterculture of feminism, which is more of a Western growing concept, which doesn't answer and resolve the solution for us. And also it kind of washes away really the true principles of, you know, what a submissive wife means and what it means to be, you know, a husband and a representative of God in the home, and what are the qualifications of having those roles, before you start to say, well, I'm the Lord of the house. Okay, well, what qualifies you? You know,
well, if you're qualified to be the Lord of the house, you would never say it.
Exactly. And what is that? It's an abuse of the power, because and you know, we can kind of dissect that and understand, and this is one of the topics, isn't it? Understanding the psychology of the abuser. And really, I'm just kind of going to get to the point here, and maybe we can elaborate on this in the time that we have. But often it's the individuals that feel extremely insecure in themselves that use this platform, any kind of platform, to control others and dominate others. But it's actually because they feel weak that they need to control and become domineering. So that's the kind of, you know, real root, really, of one of the roots of the psychology of the abuser. So then in ISKCON, you see this happening, where then there's a weaponization of the philosophy. Oh, well, I am this, you know, and you have to do this, and you have to submit, and you have to, you know, what's your role? You're not being, you know, a good wife, or and then a comparison, right? Comparison to Queen Kunti, a comparison to all these, and it just further, you know, diminishes the self-esteem of women. And really, truly, it comes from actually individual insecurity and the use of all these things to kind of prop oneself up falsely.
You really touched upon many hot topics in regards to what's happening, and I also agree definitely that ISKCON should really talk about this topic, especially because of philosophical usage of these roles that you mentioned, of men and women. And of course, we will mention that 85% of domestic abuse happens to women, and there is 15% that happens to men. So it's not like it's not happening to men. So
yeah,
it should be emphasized. But I also feel like that because we have this philosophy that speaks about the role of women, that it makes this domestic abuse justified in that sense. And also, like, if we are the devotees who follow the path of bhakti and we want to do everything right, and we are in this situation, then there's often a fear in the victim. Like, if I say something,
sorry, can I just step in there? I think we have to be careful that when we say we have a philosophy that talks about the role of women, and that propagates domestic abuse, I don't think that's true. I don't think there's anything that is there in Shastra that talks about the role of women in such a way that women should be abused. Chaitanya-Lila's point is that, you know, people misuse the statements of Shastra. And, you know, just coming back to that point of what do Shastra and Prabhupada say about abuse? Actually, there's much stronger examples in scripture against abuse than what even abusive people use as reference points to propagate or justify their abuse. And I think it is important that we talk about this. I mean, a really simple and obvious, straight in your face, which actually most people miss when they first come into the Krishna consciousness. Look at the Bhagavad Gita. What was the premise of the whole battle of Kurukshetra? Yeah. What was happening to Draupadi? Prabhupada explains that, you know, actually it was the disrobing or attempted disrobing of Draupadi that underpinned the battle of Kurukshetra. Okay, so that's domestic abuse. Her brother-in-law is trying to disrobe her, okay, and in public, and her male protectors do nothing. And what does this lead to? What's Krishna's response? Kill them all. Yeah. Okay, so I don't think there can be anything stronger than that. That, you know, that an entire global battle is fought for the protection of one woman, to give this message that actually, you know, we talk about protection of women, but women protect men. Men are born from the same wombs that women are born from. Yeah. So, you know, if we want good quality men, women should be protected. So we could have a whole session on what Shastra and Prabhupada say about actually how people should be treated which you look at that, then there's actually no room for abuse. You know, Prabhupada's often says where there is light, there's no darkness. So when we look at really, how should I treat somebody? How should I treat anyone and everyone? But then how should I treat a woman? How should I treat children, elderly? How do I treat the men in my life? How do I treat, you know, because again, speaking to Chaitanya-Lila's point about feminism isn't necessarily the answer. We have a real lack of femininity in women and in men as a direct result of women being abused, because men want to kill off that nurturing side of themselves, and so do women, because they feel that it's going to cause them to be too vulnerable. So I think it's so important for us to understand that actually scripture and Prabhupada, there isn't anything either of them say or show that in actuality justifies any abuse towards anyone, let alone abuse towards women. And it is, as Chaitanya says, it is just somebody, because of their own insecurities, they grapple at straws. But then there's also the psychology of the recipient as well, and which we'll get into. So
I only said this because of the notion of like a submission of a wife to a man who is considered to be a supreme personality of Godhead. So in that sense, it's like
but the wife's also considered the goddess, the Devi, right?
But it does talk about submissive wife, and that is that, and I know what you're saying. Look, Bhavani, that you know, it does say these things of, you know, so a submissive wife is, you know, like I mean, I can't quote exactly, but it's favored, right, to have a submissive wife. But what, you know, what does that mean? What does it really mean? And I think this, you know, circles back to the point of actually is the psychology of somebody who will take that and twist it to their own advantage. And it's really dependent on the character of the person reading the philosophy, which will create, right, the kind of knock-on effect of what then they do with that philosophy. And that's what we're talking about, isn't it? That's really the issue. And I think we need to also know and sort of kind of draw a light on the fact that so many people come into ISKCON, so many people come into Krishna consciousness from all walks of life, all backgrounds. We don't know what their childhood was, right? What their experiences have been to have created a certain psychological makeup. We don't know what their past karma is, right? We don't know what kind of role they're fulfilling in this life. And so you've got all of this baggage coming into, you know, ISKCON from all areas of the globe, and it's kind of it's like a melting pot, you know, and so individuals who have had trauma, horrific backgrounds, who have grown up, you know, witnessing violence, or haven't had a nurturing home themselves to really understand, how do I regulate my emotions? You know, when I'm angry, what do I do? Do I just lash out and, you know, slap my wife or partner, whoever? Or do I actually learn how to manage my anger and, you know, accept my emotions and go deal with it in a healthy way? A lot of people have not learned that. It depends on your own parenting. And so that comes into ISKCON. You know, we're not Vaikuntha. You know, we're in the material realm with all these horrific traumas and experiences, and people seek solace and are attracted to Krishna and the philosophy. But unfortunately, not everybody is fully, I'm not even going to say pure devotees, I'm just going to say not everybody has the ability to have a balanced psychological mindset.
Like you said, everyone comes with a baggage that's like clear. That's why nothing is perfectly.
And you know what? Actually, I'm going to say this. I get very passionate about when young girls are trying to select a husband. And they're trying to select a husband, and they're like, oh, but, you know, I want my husband to be chanting 16 rounds. I want them to be initiated. They have to be, you know, Brahmin initiated. They have to be, I have all these credentials that are expectations, and they're all external stuff. They're all, okay, you know, have a straight dhoti and tilak, and I chant my rounds every day. In the morning, I go to Mangalarti, and there's like these tick boxes. And, you know, often, right, I mean, I recently got married, and my husband is a Gurukuli. He got violently, disgustingly abused as a child by his Gurukul teachers. And he said to me the other day, he said, you know, my worst abuser, my Gurukul teacher, Sri Galim, okay, he was the one that looked like the most fixed up devotee. He went to Mangalarti every day, he chanted his rounds, he had the straightest dhoti, and yet he was sexually abusing us at night. So, and I get frustrated with the girls, because I'm like, okay, but what about the person? How are you not interested in the character of the individual? Are you not wanting to understand, okay, you know, how are they treating you? What's their mindset? What are their goals? And all you want is 16 rounds, this, you know, and it's tricky.
I totally understand. And that's like we can talk about it in the connection of like how can people actually see the signs of abuse? Can it be seen externally? And especially this, what you talked about now, is something that indicates that sometimes we cannot see who is an abuser, because he or she may act in a perfect way. But we will get to that topic. But now, if we can just go back a little bit further on, if we can mention a little bit, what do Shastra and Prabhupada talk about when they talk about domestic abuse? So, Citi-Shakti Mataji, you mentioned how it's very clear that abuse is not allowed in the Shastras, and that the abuse caused the war, the Kurukshetra, that there is a certain ethic in which the woman is treated in the Shastras, and Srila Prabhupada talks about it, but also like other categories like brahmanas, children, old men. It's always in the Shastra said that they should be protected. So there's no way that anyone is justifying an abuse. It's a culture.
No. And look at Nectar of Instruction. Nectar of Instruction speaks about how we respect every devotee. Doesn't matter if they're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Just the way you express your respect is different. So there's just our scriptures are full of example upon example of proper attitude, of healthy behavior, which leads to a flourishing human experience and flourishing divine experience and spiritual experience. So I think suffice it to say, there isn't a shortage of examples. There isn't even a shortage of examples, positive examples in scripture of how a husband who is considered the Vishnu of the home should treat his Lakshmi, his Devi in the home. You know, in this relationship of submissiveness, Prabhupada talks about where there's chastity and submissiveness, there's a peaceful life at home. But anybody and everybody, and if you want to say women in particular, becomes naturally chaste and submissive, loyal and cooperative, where there is protection and you feel safe. Think about it in all of our relationships. Where do we want to run to? When we feel threatened, we want to run where we feel safe. Isn't it? If it rains outside, you run to a shelter. Don't you run under a tree for shelter, or you find an umbrella. So this is how our healthy, loving relationships are, where one feels sheltered and protected. It automatically draws out chastity and submissiveness, because actually it's our spiritual nature to be submissive. Why is Radharani submissive to Krishna? Why is Krishna submissive to Radharani? Because they're completely safe with each other. You know, why was Prabhupada submissive to his disciples at times when he felt safe with them? You know, and why is one submissive and renders service to the spiritual master and inquires submissively? Because you feel safe and you can trust that they've seen the truth. So I think in our communities, sometimes we may be in a situation where we can't practically help someone get out of a situation, or we can't practically help someone, even an abuser who's come to us saying, I'm struggling with my anger. You know, I want to talk about this. And we may feel, oh my God, I don't know the practical things to do. I'm not a healthcare professional, or I don't know how domestic violence things work. But we can address with them, we can talk to them and replace the misconstructs that they've clung to with healthy constructs, and encourage them to seek help, whichever side we're speaking to, because that is we even in scripture, yes, scripture's revelatory, you know, it's understood by revelation, by surrender, but we're also directed by desire. You know, Krishna's revelation is directed by a desire. So if someone's going to look for a reason to hurt, they will find it. If someone's going to look for a reason to protect, they will find it.
Yeah, that's totally true. And also, Chaitanya-Lila, I don't know if you mentioned it, or Citi-Shakti Mataji, like we should also look at the example of Srila Prabhupada, how he treated everyone, men and women in his movement, whatever was written and spoken in his books. Like his example was always loving towards everyone and protective towards everyone. And that's what we should all follow in our institution. Okay, so another topic is, another connected to what we are speaking now is like, how does domestic abuse impact us, and how does it affect not only the victim but everyone around, who's especially in spiritual institutions, I would say, how it affects all of us. So what is the impact of domestic abuse according to how you see it? What is your experience?
Chaitanya-Lila, do you want to start with this one?
I think the first thing we have to know is how much it's behind closed doors and it's not seen, it's not heard, and how secret it becomes. Yeah. So the external, presentation of individuals or couples or families is one thing, but then what terror could be happening behind the closed doors. And so that's just something to kind of be aware of. And what does that mean? It's like, okay, maybe that that means that we don't know what's really going on with people in their lives, so maybe we can be more kind, right? Be more kind to each other and in our community, and that can facilitate a safe, like Chithi was saying, like why would someone be submissive and open up and have loving exchanges? Because we feel safe. So if we're kinder in our community to one another, because who knows what's happening in our personal lives, then that can facilitate more loving exchanges. So anyway, that's not answering your question, but I just thought that was an important point. And the impact, on the victims, on the individual level, and then sort of on the systemic level of the family. And so, the individual, the victim, is going to be impacted in terms of their self-esteem, their self-worth, their ability to have the confidence to have autonomy and agency in their life, to make their own decisions. So what starts to happen is the abuse can tend to kind of erode the individual's sense of self, and they become almost like a shell of a person. There's a lot of self-doubt that starts to creep in because of the manipulation, the psychological coercion. So one begins to internally in the mind self-doubt, and because of this self-doubt, they are not able to fully be themselves and give to their family, give to the world, and even do service. Sometimes the self-esteem the self-doubt creeps in so drastically that they then begin to start to even question whether, does Krishna love me? And then that starts to erode their ability to even serve Krishna, to love Krishna, to trust Krishna. And that is the highest damage that one can make, when one starts to doubt their own spiritual connection, and lose that. So a few things.
Thank you. Citi-Shakti, what would you say?
Yeah, so the impact of anything is, it's like the ripple effect, right? We've got to look at what's happening now and beyond, and sometimes actually seeing how it affects in the long term can motivate people more than just looking at, although it's extremely, each individual is extremely important, sometimes highlighting what a huge impact it has on the people around you can be exactly what someone needs to hear to get out. Because often victims of domestic abuse will allow it to continue because they think, okay, well, the children don't see it, or nobody knows it's happening. I can continue my service. I can continue my work. I seem to be okay. I'm managing. There's no big, obvious detriment. And in the meantime, as Chaitanya-Lila was saying, yes, it's eroding the self-esteem and hampering spiritual progress and even ability to be effective here. But what's also going on is you're contributing to a vicious cycle. And someone has to break that cycle. Otherwise, that vicious cycle, quite literally, it just continues generation after generation after generation. Children are extremely perceptive. Even if they don't see anything, they can hear and they can pick up in terms of their instinct. They're very emotionally sensitive. And in fact, for many children, it's more frightening and more damaging to hear what's going on rather than see it, because they hear cries or bangs or screaming. Their imagination is going to go wild, okay? And what happens is not only is the person who's being abused going to have challenges with regulating their emotion, as well as the person who's abusing, but children also then grow up in an environment where they don't learn how to regulate their emotions or understand their emotions, because abusers will often make victims and anybody who's witness, who's in the environment, try and believe a different story. And when you believe a different story constantly, you stop losing trust in your own understanding of yourself and you misjudge. So you then create another generation of children who grow up into adults who don't know how to understand their feelings, who don't know how to understand other people's feelings and read them properly, who have dysregulated emotions and don't have healthy tools to not just regulate their emotions, but also express themselves. And so you then get either a generation of abusers or those who are susceptible to abuse, because that's what they recognize as love.
And in your opinion, how do you break this vicious cycle?
Because it can go into your leadership then as well, right? We were talking about earlier, even cases in institutional abuse. When we take a leadership role, we follow a leader, we're often carrying, where do we learn how to interact with authority in our childhood? Our first authority we interact with is our parents. We carry that into our guru-disciple relationships. We also carry that into our leadership roles. So how do we break this cycle? Is if you've especially, and I can speak from personal experience, there are generations where there's generations that have gone before you, where there's been domestic abuse. You may not have the backing of those previous generations to get out, because for them it's like, well, we're fine. It's been going on for generations. We're all right. We've got a roof over our head. The family's together. What's the big deal? There's food on the. Do you know what I mean? Like that's all we're doing. We're just living to survive. Almost that justifies it. So it can be difficult to break the cycle, but it takes one person to make that decision that better I cause the pain now. Better this is being addressed now. So you have to make a mess first sometimes before you tidy up. Yeah. When you spring clean your house, don't you take everything out of the cupboard before you put it back in an ordered fashion? Even Srila Prabhupada says you have to, devotees should be willing to do whatever it takes to help their Krishna consciousness, even if it's socially unacceptable. Okay. And often people won't leave because they think it's more socially unacceptable to be without a husband, or to be without family, or to be seen as divorced, or this or that, or to be viewed as the person who caused the problem. Okay. And so breaking that vicious cycle takes every single person who is willing to address domestic abuse and all the many forms of it and different levels of severity, and nip it in the bud, even at the seeds. The sooner you address it, the better. you are doing everybody a favor, not just yourself. You are protecting yourself from further damage. You are protecting the people around you from further damage, and you are protecting the abuser, because the abuser is not just committing sin. The abuser is also engaging in Vaishnava aparadh.
Yeah.
So out of compassion for that person, if you can't have compassion for yourself, and the compassion, and you think you were madly in love with this person, and they can't manage without you, and that's why you stay, do the most compassionate thing for them. Stop them from committing an invasion of aparadh, and get yourself out first before you think about getting them help.
This is so important what you said. We we forget that in this community we are dealing with Vaishnavas around us, and everyone is a devotee, and whatever we do to them in that sense, we are making Vaishnava aparadha. So especially with abuse, and people should be really, really aware of that.
You know, what one thing that's kind of ironic that I come across so much is, you know, this use of don't criticize because then you're committing an offense. So it's instead of committing an offense, evasion of aparadh, by saying, oh, this person, you know, is abusive, but the abuse isn't, and you can't talk about it, so you can't kind of, the community can't do anything to stop the abuse because they're not allowed to say that someone's being abusive because that's committing an offense because you're criticizing. when the evasion of aparadh is happening right there. So you know, we need to have proper understanding of really what does it mean to point out something of reality. You know, I was just talking to somebody about this today, that a snake is a snake. You know, if we can't say that the snake is poisonous and we need to stay away from the snake, then because, oh, it's a spirit soul and, you know, we have to be nice and avoid committing offenses, then how are we going to protect ourselves from the poisonous snake?
Yeah, so much.
Nicely put.
Yeah, there's so many layers we can actually cover when talking about domestic abuse in a spiritual community like ISKCON. It's so much connected to the philosophy, and as we were saying, like the understanding of the philosophy, and then it gets so complicated because people don't have the right understanding. And yeah, and then in the end, I'm not saying this happens, but sometimes it can happen that it's like because of all of this that we are talking about, there is a support to the abuse where there should be none. If you understand what I mean, just because of these issues, like if I say something, I will commit a Vaishnava aparadha, I will do this, I should be like that, and so on.
Yeah. And you know, that happens also because the you know, touching on the psychology of the abuser is often abuse. A lot of abusive people are also very high achievers and charming. Yeah. So what you get on the front face of it is a very charming, very likable, high achieving individual that might be doing a lot of service, you know, and achieving a lot, right, in the name of ISKCON, but abusing on the side. And so what happens is it's often those individuals that kind of get propped up on this pedestal, and that creates this gap of, I'm a small devotee, this is a big devotee, and then I can't say then, oh, this person's actually doing something wrong, because then if I say that, then I'm committing an aparadh and I'm criticizing somebody. Oh, so great. Oh, I'm sure she'll come back in. So, you know, so that's what happens also with abusive people, because abusive people, remember, they're highly manipulative. Okay, many of them, right? Highly manipulative, highly charming. So this is kind of going on to the kind of topic of narcissism. I don't know if we're there yet, but
yes, you can mention that.
Yeah. So, you know, the character traits of, you know, narcissists or abusive individuals, in order for them to gain power and abuse the power, they have to do something to get it, and often that is using manipulative tactics. And so that will involve, you know, being highly charming to kind of ingratiate people and get people on their side so that they can use them and gain power and leverage to then, you know, be the one in power, be the one in charge, and then suppress the people underneath. And so the more that happens, they become, and in ISKCON, what happens is they become greater and greater in status and power and fame and position, and they get seen as a pure devotee. But externally, they're doing all of these things, but internally or behind the closed doors, they're abusing, they're using, they're, you know, taking advantage of people's loyalty, people's submissive nature, and using that to prop themselves up. And then, like I said, this feeds into this whole thing of they get seen as the pure devotee, and know they're then protected by this philosophy. Don't criticize because it's Vaishnava Aparat. They're then protected, and it further perpetuates their abuse.
So, Citi-Shakti Mataji, you disappeared, but then we continued to talk about the effect of abuse, actually.
I was touching on the fact that, you know, abuses, because generally they are manipulative, and I touched on narcissism and how these individuals gain in power and position in ISKCON, get seen as then a pure devotee, and then are protected by this concept of don't criticize, Vaishnava Aparad, and then that, you know, perpetuates the abuse that they commit.
And from all of this that you now mentioned, I mean, we mentioned a lot of stuff, but it's also important to emphasize this question of how does this domestic abuse we have a domestic abuse which is experienced at home from certain person or partner with whom we live, but we also know that this affects everyone. It affects the family, but it also affects the community in which we are. So how does this, and you also mentioned how this affects our bhakti, in the sense that we think like, well, maybe, you know, Krishna wants this for me, and then maybe the person loses faith and so on. So maybe from this aspect, and also if we don't receive the support from the community, if we don't have a safe space where we can actually say what is happening to us, how does that affect an individual's also faith? I mean, individual as his self-esteem, we mentioned that, but also since we are talking about the spiritual community here, how does this affect the faith of an individual? If you can say something about that.
You know, I was just reflecting on these relationships that we have that are toxic, as well as having a relationship that's toxic. One of the methods that an abuser will use is to isolate you from your protective relationships. And I think this is another way we can help as a community, is keep reaching out, stay connected, because where there's a lot of love, it outweighs the fear, and also helps you to have clarity, you know, and gives you the strength to recognize before you even get out. I remember many years ago, I asked Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj about this whole issue of domestic abuse. I asked him straight up. I said, you know, Guru Maharaj, if a man is hurting his wife, what should she do? And he said, you know, people hurt each other for many reasons. And I know we've been talking about narcissism and maybe antisocial personality traits, and very few people have full-on narcissistic personality disorder and, you know, antisocial personality disorder. Many more people have just traits of them which feed into their self-protection mechanism. But you also get a lot of people who actually they're actually repeating behavior that they've observed. Okay, kids will often repeat the behavior that they see their parents do, whether it's smoking, drinking, going to Mangal Arti. They'll model themselves, right? Which is a powerful tool, but it's dangerous. So some people actually just struggle because there's a personality clash. They don't know how to regulate their emotions. It's not that they're intentionally setting about to do. There are those who do that, but there's many who don't. And so I asked him straight, well, he said there's many reasons that someone might abuse or hurt, a man might hit a woman. He said sometimes it's a personality issue, sometimes it's something more serious, and there's something seriously wrong with him. He said whatever it is, there's never an excuse. None of them are good enough excuses. he can find whatever way he needs to regulate his temper. He can go for a walk, whatever he needs to do. Okay. So, okay, but what if they don't change? And he said, so then you get out. And I said, what if it's your karma? Okay, I asked him this first question, what if it's your karma? He looked very deeply into my eyes, very straight up, and he said, you don't have to accept your karma. Now, what did he mean by this? You know, I mean, he said this to me about 20 years ago. You don't have to accept your karma. And it's something that I feel like I understand and try to understand more and more and more. And by Krishna's mercy, there's more and more insight. But this whole idea that we bring patterns into this world, and we may receive, like, certain events may happen to us, people come into our life because we've made previous choices, engaged in particular previous actions, etc. But to accept our karma means we take it as it is. We don't do anything with it. And our whole process of Krishna consciousness is really about, is what I'm about to do, is what I'm about to say, is what I'm thinking, is what I'm experiencing going to be uplifting for me and the other person. And so in accepting or rejecting our karma, if we have this kind of gold standard of, is this nourishing my Krishna consciousness? Because inevitably, whatever nourishes our Krishna consciousness is going to nourish our human state of health as well. It's not, oh, those things which are nourishing in our Krishna consciousness, sometimes, you know, they may be damaging for our human health. No, you look at Krishna's instructions on how to connect with him. None of them are there to hurt us. None of them. Even austerity, Prabhupada says austerity is voluntary. There isn't an absolute level of austerity. Raghunath Das Goswami may be happy with with his purity. He's able to connect with the deep bhakti in a few grains of rice from the gutter, from the prasad from a devotee's house. But that's not the standard for everybody. You see what I mean? Krishna's saying everybody must live on a few grains of rice. He says one who eats too much, eats too little, sleeps too much, sleeps too little, can never be a yogi. That's relative. That clearly shows relativity. So the human side's always relative. So this point of, we don't have to accept our karma. Yes, something may have come to us, whether it's a test, whether Krishna's using us as an example, whether it's karma, and there's no shame in having karma. That's the thing. We have so much stigma around karma. Oh, I need to be a pure devotee who doesn't have karma.
That's impossible.
If a pure devotee has karma, they have enough karma to keep them here. That doesn't mean they're bound by their karma. So, or controlled by their karma, right? There's a difference driving your vehicle and being in control of it versus being controlled by your car. So this point of, we don't have to accept our karma means, yes, this has come to me. First of all, am I going to receive it? And how am I going to receive it? And in what shape or form am I going to deal with it? So this can be, for me, when I heard this, it was extremely empowering, and I applied it to many different areas of my life. And unfortunately, the area I needed to apply it to most, it took me a bit of time to apply it to. But when I did, it worked. And it didn't just work to help my human situation. It really opened my heart to connecting with the process, whether it was chanting, reading, letting devotees in, trusting devotees more. So this is this whole purpose of, our faith and our faith being damaged. It often comes because we also have an immature understanding of Shastra.
I really think it's wonderful. It's really totally logical, and also for anyone who is listening to this and who thinks that there is a lack of faith due to certain circumstances in life, I think this advice and everything that you said, I mean, I would consider it very helpful. So it's wonderful. Thank you. Chaitanya-Lila, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking on this topic of karma, and it's true. We don't know our past. We don't know what we have done, why certain people have come into our life, why certain circumstances have come into our life, and we're all born. We're all born into this life with a certain baggage, a certain lot of whatever nastiness and benefic experiences that we have to go through. But I and maybe these are really, really deep concepts that probably need, like, you know, real discussion and in sanghas, and, you know, how can we really go beyond what's happening to us externally, and through all of our experiences really recognize that, because really, sorry, let me take one step back. Our karma and our negative karma is really there so that we can spiritually evolve. Like from a true spiritual perspective, it is there to help us evolve. And through our suffering and through our struggle, we can grow. We can grow in our connection to Krishna. And, you know, I mean, let's take Draupadi's example, right? Horrific, and it should never have happened. Okay, it was never condoned, but she made the best out of a horrific deal, and she surrendered, and is considered a pure devotee, right? And that example is sort of like, you know, pinnacle moment of her life, you know, in showing that she's such a pure devotee, dedicated devotee of Krishna. And so if whatever we go through, if we can get to that point in our life at some point, then it makes all of it, right, worth it. Right. And so, but these are very deep spiritual concepts. And so it doesn't mean that therefore one should be abused. Right. And so these principles should not be abused by abusers and weaponized by abusers. Oh, well, I'm giving you your karma, so, you know, you can surrender to Krishna and it will help.
Nor should we keep it. Nor should we keep it, because we think that.
But we shouldn't. Well, we don't have to digest it and accept it as it defines me. And nor should we stay in the situation just, oh, okay, you know, I'll just whack the thing over my head and, you know, one day I'll become pure devotee. No, that you know, that's it. It has to be. We should always try and make sure that we're in a better situation and a protected situation and out of abusive situations. But if it comes out of, like, outside of our control, then how are we going to digest it? We have to understand that this is something that's happening as a part of this kind of role that I'm playing in this life, and I can surrender to Krishna through it whilst I get to a better situation. And I don't have to identify with it.
Yeah.
It doesn't define me.
Yeah.
But your point, whilst you're trying to get out of it, not that I'm going to stay in it.
I'm going to stay because,
yeah,
absolutely, we should not be accepting, as you know, Citi-Shakti was saying, like Bhakti Tirtha Swami was talking about, is, well, we shouldn't stay in abusive situations. I mean, what good is that going to do? You know, how are we meant to, you know, be proactive in life if we're just kind of staying in a situation where we're getting beaten and you know, bullied? And no, that's not healthy. You know, we want to always be in a better situation.
So I would like to then continue and ask you that what factors determine whether the abuse will lead to mental health conditions such as PTSD, depression, or anxiety? If you can say something about that.
So we've been talking a lot about the experience of abuse as something happening to us. There are so many layers to us, right? We have this physical body, we have a subtle body, which is our mind, our intelligence, and our sense of identity. And we've talked a lot about our human sense of identity and the impact abuse has on our human sense of identity. We've also talked about the impact it has on our spiritual sense of identity. So when you're looking at mental health conditions, and I know we're going to speak about it a little bit in the next session, but people will often associate, oh, okay, well, if the abuse is really bad, the person will have depression, or they'll have anxiety, or they might have PTSD. But there are a lot of high functioning women who suffer abuse. Because if you look at PTSD, depression, or anxiety, they are considered mental illnesses or mental disorders. And they're caused by many different things. Okay, they're caused by biological factors, changes in the body, from your nutrition to your hormonal health to stress, okay, physical stress, emotional stress, your own psychological patterns, your ability to adapt or be resilient or have confidence, your sources of self-esteem, your sources of self-worth. And sometimes a victim one of the reasons they may justify, if they end up feeling they have to stay in a situation, they may justify staying, is it keeps the stress level in some very skewed self-protective way less, right? Whereas when you start to fight it, it can be more stressful when you see, oh, this is wrong. And that in itself can be stressful. So there are many factors, also your past, how you're resting, so many different things affect whether a traumatic incident is going to lead to a mental health problem. But the two are not equivocal. So you can have, a relatively small trauma can lead to PTSD. And someone can go through something extremely traumatic and not get PTSD. So I guess with this question, what I'd like to just say is, don't use the degree of someone's overt suffering as a measurement of whether they're experiencing something difficult at home. Okay, some people will have a very huge reaction to maybe just one very mild comment being made to them. Somebody else may be experiencing every aspect of domestic abuse, and when you see them, they look absolutely fine and they're high functioning and they actually seem very well in themselves. And that has got to do with many factors, which the human side, their karma, but also their faith and their relationship with Krishna. So there are many factors that determine whether the abuse leads to mental health conditions. But mental health conditions are not necessarily an accurate measure of the degree of severity of whether something's happening. Just like, Chaitanya-Lila used the example of, you can't judge whether someone's a good devotee based on their clothing or their position, or their name or who they're associated with, or the price of their clothes, or their even the language that they use. You can't always tell, so don't judge a book by its cover. Just seeing someone suffer it's obviously a red flag, something's going on most of the time, but just because that's absent, don't assume that my friend or my relative who flagged up that this person's hurting them, but they seem okay, so it can't be that bad. So I'll just tell them to stay in the relationship because they seem happy otherwise.
Yeah, a lot of things happen below the surface, like you mentioned, Chaitanya-Lila. Like, we often see people externally, and also, I had experiences with people who look like they're very powerful, like powerful ladies, but actually they're quite suffering because of the stress, because of the abuse, and so on. So yeah, it's totally true what you have said. So
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to add just a small point, which is about trauma and the impact. Like Citi-Shakti was saying, that the impact, the impact of the abuse, which can lead to PTSD, can depend on the individual's resilience, and often that is dependent on their past experiences. So research shows that, victims of childhood abuse, are less resilient than if they experience abuse in adulthood. And so it's just a small point, really, just that, we don't know what people have been through in their childhood, and what really can determine their level of resilience to a small comment or, a more physical domestic violence situation. So it's not always determined by the abuse that is externally happening, but it's the experience of the abuse that will cause the suffering.
Just coming back to Shastra, sometimes devotees who are in abusive situations will turn to the beautiful pastime of Haridas Thakur, and when he's beaten in 20 marketplaces, and how he prays for forgiveness for those who are beating him. Now, I aspire to one day even have a drop of Haridas Thakur's level of surrender to the holy name, and deep relationship with Krishna. But what people forget is that what happens next. Because he's somebody who's able to control his life to a point where he actually stops. They're so exhausted by his spiritual strength and how their physical strength pales in comparison to his physical strength, his spiritual strength, that they can't even really actually touch him. Okay, he's not actually damaged by anything they've done. So they actually beg him, look, please, we are actually going to be killed by the king. And so he's able to put himself in a trance-like state and says, throw me in the river. But he comes out and he corrects the king. So this is just taking half the story doesn't help. And, it's when we look at it as a whole, the key principle that Haridas Thakur represents is not just surrender to the holy name and to Krishna, but also compassion. What's the most compassionate thing? And I guess the reason I'm raising this is we can draw strength, and I want to come back to this point that Chaitanya-Lila said, is that we can draw strength on so much from Shastra to give us faith that Krishna's always got our back, Guru's always got our back, but we must make our endeavor to make things better. And sometimes often making things better means getting out and getting space. A problem looks smaller immediately as soon as you take a step away from it. When you're close to it, it looks bigger. So take a step, get away from it, because even for the abuser, it gives them the space to reflect. If the person you're abusing is right there, you don't have space to look at yourself. You get away, you're doing them a favor. And I feel like we need to just keep coming back to this point, because that is the hardest thing to convince anyone of, is that actually it's a good thing to take space. It's a good thing, even whether it's temporary or permanent, it's a good thing to take space. Get some distance between you and your problem. Then it's your problem. It's not you. It's a problem. So yeah, it's and then we're less likely, it improves our resilience. We're less likely to get depression, anxiety, PTSD. Prabhupada and Krishna don't want us to get PTSD and depression, anxiety. That's not why they've set our life up like this. They do want us to flourish, so making choices helps us to flourish, but making choices that are in our best interest, and don't, again, as if you're a victim of abuse, don't help your abuser by taking bits of Shastra to justify their behavior for them as well.
Yeah, I like how you emphasize compassion also towards everyone, even the person who abuses. And we can talk about that a little bit further on. Now, if we can just touch upon why people return to abusive situations even after they have made a decision to leave. Chaitanya-Lila, if you can start now.
I think because a large part of abuse and the dynamic of abuse is not necessarily external. It's internal. It's in the mind. So somebody can leave the home and physically leave, but psychologically they have all these impressions. They have the words, the echoes of the bullying, the manipulation of the mind remains. And so on that psychological level, there's guilt that sets in, right? Well, if I didn't do this, if I hadn't not put the dishes correctly in place, then that wouldn't have happened. And he's only trying to be helpful, or he doesn't mean it actually. He's just doesn't know how to control his temper sometimes. It's not his fault, he's gone through a lot in his life, maybe he's stressed. So all these justifications are going on psychologically. And there's also the cycle of abuse that happens as well, right? So often perpetrators of violence, perpetrators of abuse will do a lot of apologizing and gift giving and trying to make up, and that can kind of win the victim back and play on, you know, tug on the heartstrings, essentially, and then the cycle continues. Essentially, the cycle continues. So it's more of a psychological thing rather than a physical, whether you're there or whether you're not there. It's how much the abuser has been able to manipulate the mind of the victim. And I think we were also going to touch, and I'll just mention, maybe we can elaborate, or Citi-Shakti can elaborate as well, that, you know, victims of abuse, and I think actually you did touch on it, victims of abuse and their psychology. Why is it that that type of person has met with the abusive type, right? Perhaps they don't have enough sort of sense of self, agency, ability to sort of assert themselves, be assertive, understand who they are. So, and they're more agreeable, right? And so they're more susceptible to being abused.
Equally, you get very smart, high-functioning, intelligent women who get abused.
That's the other side.
How does that happen? You know, I had a very good description from a solicitor once. It's like boiling a frog to death slowly. So you put a frog in a pan of boiling water, it'll jump out, right? But you put a frog in a pan of cold water, it'll stay. You turn the gas on underneath, and slowly the water gets warmer, warmer, warmer. The frog doesn't really notice, and then it boils to death. Okay, so I'm actually really pleased that Chaitanya-Lila started with, actually, when you leave, it's physically leaving is not enough. Psychologically leaving is the biggest challenge, because the methods that are employed, and I won't repeat the ones that Chaitanya-Lila's already said, but they often lead the victim to, I don't like the word victim, but we'll use it just for language sake, but the victim to think that they're responsible for the actions, that the perpetrator can't live without them and do without them, that they're the only person who understands that abuser, okay, that they love that abuser and the abuser loves them, and they've got a special kind of a relationship that nobody else understands. And they convince themselves that if they stay, they're staying out of love for the other person. Overlay on this, lots of people give the answer that, oh, people often stay for practical reasons. They're financially dependent. They don't want the children to be without a father. All of those things are there. But actually, at the essence of it, and I'm speaking from personal experience, you convince yourself that you're staying out of love, when in actuality, you're staying out of fear. Okay, because the fear of losing all of these things that are actually meaningless, they only have a place for us in society and in this life for a short time, is stronger than our real desire to be loved. And I'm going to put this bluntly, because I feel like I can, because of personal experience, that, you know, you can get to a point where your attachment to being a good wife is stronger than your attachment to surrender to Krishna.
Yeah, totally true.
You know, and
the shame of the divorce also.
Say that again?
The shame of the divorce of it.
Yeah, shame of the divorce, shame of being blamed, because abusers will often, they'll overdevelop this because they don't take responsibility for their own actions. So they place it on the victim, and the victim has an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. And when it's an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, in one sense, that's like a God complex, that my choices, my ability to influence this situation far outweighs that person's, and even far outweighs Krishna's. Right? So it sounds harsh, but if you can get to a point where you actually and say to yourself, there's actually what I'm recognizing as love isn't actually love, even though it feels like this, might feel like a mushy feeling or a painful feeling in the heart, or might give you that, you know, one can get addicted to the ups and downs, the emotional highs and lows of the relationship, you know, that whole thing of material happiness being the relief from misery. That's what the abuser plays on. The abuser plays on, I will give you relief from the misery, and that relief from the misery is seen as kindness, is seen as love, is seen as happiness. It's kind of messed up. But if we can admit to ourselves that I'm in a messed up situation and I need to get out, you'll do it. But it takes a lot for us to admit, for one to go, actually, this is not good, because we want to believe that we're in a good situation.
So true. Yeah, thank you for all your thoughts. Of course, we touched upon why someone abuses someone. We mentioned it throughout our conversations. I would also like to maybe emphasize like that's how I saw it through what I read, like that maybe the most general profile of a person who is an abuser is either, as you explained, the person who was abused and who was in this cycle of abusive relationships throughout his life and his family and so on. So therefore he or she takes off the pattern. But also there is this narcissistic personality type of person who is also seen as an abuser. So can you tell a little bit, because if we're going to talk about a little bit about a profile of a person who abuses, what can we say? And also one of our questions was like, what are the red flags in the abuser's behavior that people can look out for example? So if we can say something about that.
I mean, I think, if you look at narcissism or sociopathic traits, right? I think it's all over social media and internet now, with the freedom of sharing information, you get some bad information, but in there's also some good things. So people talk about narcissism and antisocial, but actually alongside what we were talking about, this topic of people have often been through abuse themselves, either familial or relationship previously. Narcissistic traits and sociopathic traits are often a result of those experiences. Okay, so if you look at a sociopath or a narcissist, or you look at somebody who's adopted those traits, they're using, they've not been protected, they've not been cared for. So they've developed these very disordered ways to protect themselves. So the narcissist, for example, or somebody with narcissistic traits has got such a fragile sense of who they are. Such a weak sense of who they are. They literally are whoever the world sees them as. So they could be completely poor, but if the world sees them as rich, then in their mind, they're rich. So in this way, they're able to almost compulsively lie at the drop of a hat to create whatever needs to be perceived and adapt themselves to that to protect themselves. And if that's compromised at all, they lose their temper, because their ego is very fragile. Their sense of self-esteem in this world is very fragile. So they don't take feedback, criticism very well. They don't take a compromising position very well. And they almost train themselves for their own self-protection from a very, very early age to just morph into and become whatever they need to. And you'll often see these people maintain a different constructs around their life with different groups of people, and there may not be overlap between their different groups of people, but each group of person who knows them in a different way, and they never meet, they never interact. So yeah, there's a whole spectrum of narcissism. And then you look at, for example, sociopathic traits where there's a lack of empathy. Rules and regulations don't mean so much. Everything's a means to an end. Okay, again, that's there for self-protection. Pretty much if you look on the most severe end of the spectrum, where you have got not full-blown narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality or sociopathic personality disorder, when I'm attempting to treat patients with those personality disorders, it's inevitable that they've suffered severe trauma earlier in their life. It's inevitable they've suffered it. And the way their personality is developed, I mean, I know you may bring this up later, but one of the reasons they're resistant to change, the more severe it is because their thinking protects them from breaking down. Now, I remember a narcissistic PD asking me once, do you think therapy will help me? And I said, yes, therapy can help you, but it will break down everything you think you are. And that may be extremely difficult for you. And if you're not ready for that, then start with something a bit more gentle if you're not yet ready to break down all the constructs, because the insight is difficult. They will quite literally see a mirror held up in front of themselves. You put a mirror in front of that person and they'll say, that's not me you're showing me, it's something else.
That sounds scary.
It is, and living with that is even more scary.
Yeah. Chaitanya-Lila, would you like to add? Contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's so nicely put by Citi-Shakti, and the damaged, I don't like to use the word damaged, but maybe say wounded, the wounded inner self of the narcissistic type, or the antisocial type, or psychopathic, that wounded inner self is so buried deep behind all of these sort of constructs of, these constructs of personality, right, that have been really copied and pasted, as Citi-Shakti was saying about, like, okay, it's a reflection of the outside world, but that inner kind of wounded child is so deep and so hard to reach, that's why all of these defenses are so much stronger and hard to break down. And it's very hard for those types of individuals to be able to reach that inner place and really kind of sort through this chasm, right, of these personality constructs and really the inner self. And often it's too hard to bear, it's too hard to deal with the shame. Often it's a lot of shame that's there, and guilt. It's too hard to bear, and so it's just a lot easier for those types of individuals to function, with these false created constructs of themselves. But it doesn't work like in a healthy way at all. But it gets them where they want to, which is this false idea of position, power, and status. And all it does is just feed the ego. They're really functioning on an ego level rather than a kind of grounded sense of self, let alone spiritual, real, true spiritual sense of self.
I was going to also say, you'll often get those with narcissistic traits and sociopathic traits very attracted to and drawn to people who are very empathic empaths, because an empath will understand, and because an empath understands, they may also then just accept. I really want to caveat that one of the reasons we're exploring the psychology of an abuser is so we can help people to recognize this also at home, but in any leadership position. Okay. Not to justify. Just because you understand, it doesn't mean it's okay. The understanding of the psychology of something or someone is enriches the growth. It's there to enrich the growth. It's there so that we can be better family members, better friends, better leaders, and be compassionate and kind. But it's not there to justify. And I think we have to be just very careful about that just because we understand why someone is behaving a particular way, it doesn't mean it's okay for them to behave that way. I will say to my patients point blank, sometimes I'll say, look, your mental illness is not an excuse for you to shout at me or swear at me, or hold a chair over my head or be violent. It's not an excuse. And they're surprised sometimes that the boundaries being laid, but it helps. It helps because when we say no to something, it gives us space to say yes to something better.
A nice message of hope for everyone. I wanted to put this what we were talking about into the context of spiritual communities, because Chaitanya-Lila, you mentioned how sometimes the abuser is in a role of a leadership or has a very important role. And then we can add this reflection of the society on the person, where he looks in a certain way because it's validated by the society, but on the other hand, at home, the person is quite violent to his or her family members. So can you say, I mean, this is a problem in our community sometimes when it happens, because it feels like, I'm not saying it is, but it feels like the person is more protected than the victim sometimes because of the position that the person has. So maybe if you can say something like that regarding that.
I think it's a very pertinent topic at this very point, you know, in ISKCON and in many directions, you know, and I know and I appreciate that this is not the topic, but and we won't necessarily go into that because it's not for today or not for this, you know, purpose. But we see it in ISKCON with child abuse, and you know, and really it's sort of a similar principle in one sense of the power shift. You know, one is holding a power, and the victim has less power, and it's the abuse of that position and power on the other individual. And so, you know, this very point is very pertinent in ISKCON. I think it really goes back to the same point really that I was saying before, which is when someone is in a leadership position, they are seen to be doing some extraordinary service. And I say service because, I mean, we don't really know what the intention of that person is. Maybe they're in leadership because actually they really internally, maybe unconsciously, want the power. So who are we really serving? Are we really serving Prabhupada? Are we really serving your ego? Right? But because they're doing something grand externally, they look like they're doing some bigger, better service, some more important service. But, you know, really, Krishna doesn't distinguish between, you know, building a temple or washing the pot. It's really the quality of the heart, right? And what's being offered to Krishna internally. That's what he's after rasa. He's Rasa Raj. He wants the rasa. He doesn't want the bricks, right? And the buildings, or the, you know, the numbers of the books that have been sold. He wants the ras. And so we just have to be less externally dependent and really start to have a deeper vision and deeper relationships. So I don't know if I answered your question, but this happens a lot in ISKCON because of that perception. Yeah.
Maybe Citi-Shakti, if you can say something about it, and I would then like add to a question like how to change that it exists, but how to change that. What do we as devotees and persons in this community can do about these things?
Well, I won't repeat that it exists because I think that's plainly obvious. It exists everywhere, not just in ISKCON, where someone's seeking validation and power and position. Sometimes that's the reason they get into Krishna consciousness. And there's some good faith that, you know, we all come, most people come to Krishna consciousness with mixed faith. Okay, their faith becomes purified, their practice becomes purified, their heart becomes purified. But where there isn't good sadhana coupled with deep loving relationships. Deep loving relationships means not just closeness and I'll just accept whatever you do, but there's mutual honesty here, not just about what we celebrate, but also what we find challenging. You know, many of our leaders don't have that, especially of a certain generation. They don't have that. And there's a whole host of reasons why they might not have that. Some of it might be they don't want it. Some of it might be they didn't have opportunity to because they were doing so much. But that, again, these are not justifications. If we're going to invite in an era of less problems with abuse, there needs to be recognition, eradication, healing, but also in terms of our Krishna consciousness, this idea of going deeper is really about the things we need to do to have deeper quality relationships in sadhana, because this is the essence of our spiritual life, right? Essence of our spiritual life is deep. What are the 6 loving exchanges? Revealing your mind in confidence, and sharing with others confidentially. This should be available to everybody across the board. This enables us to have good sadhana because we're able to free our mind of those things that interfere with our sadhana. Those small seeds that can then grow into abuse, that can then grow into exploitation. It helps us to identify when, is my service or is it just work? Is it out of grandiosity? Is it to maintain a certain position? Because that's what leads you into spiritual narcissism, right? Narcissism is this, we talked about this idea of having a persona as your identity rather than really knowing who you are. Spiritual narcissism is that extra layer where your spirituality is about the position and the role, the devotional qualities that others perceive you with. You're so busy trying to look like a devotee that you don't have time to actually be a devotee and be devoted, So how do we stop it? There's stages. And like I said before, we got to make a mess sometimes before we clear up. And things are going to look messy because we're talking about all of this stuff. People are going to get called out. People are going to be held to task. It will mean that, projects might be disrupted. People's faith may be broken. Okay. That's to be expected. And I think if we know that that's coming, then we can also then put into place those things that are needed to reinstate people's faith. Because actually our relationship with Krishna and Guru never breaks. In real life, it never actually is broken. It's up to us whether we stay connected and we're willing to accept that connection through others who are ready and willing and endowed with the ability to give that to us, whether there are peers, friends, fans, it doesn't matter, so we've started, we should continue, be prepared to make a mess, but then look at the mess and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we've got a lot of good stuff as well. We've got some amazing leaders. We've got some amazing devotees. We need to also get better at recognizing what it means to be a devotee, and to the sincere person, even if we're not protected right now, when we're ready to receive that protection, it will come. It will come. What happened to Draupadi? Krishna was asked, why did you wait till the last minute? So because you were holding on so tightly. It's when you let go I came, So that's I think there's so many, like Chaitanya-Lila said, it's a whole other conversation. How do we address this in leadership? Because you think about it, any given temple is grappling with manpower, resources, just like any household is, right? And you have a leader whose personal life doesn't reflect their public life, and you call it out and you have to remove that person. It has in the immediate term, it has an impact, definitely. But the undercurrent is in the long term, for generations, it's also having an impact. And that impact it's kind of like, when you have certain like tree rot, on the surface, the tree looks fine, but underneath it's dying. And it's only when you peel away the bark that you see it, that slowly it's dying inside. So by allowing people to continue in leadership positions where they're exploiting, it's killing our organization, killing the devotees' hearts, and it's diseasing. This ISKCON is Prabhupada, right? It's Prabhupada's body. We don't want to decay his body from the inside whilst it just looks nice on the outside. So I'd say be prepared to make a mess and then a big cleanup.
Yes, that's definitely true. Yes, Chaitanya.
I want to just say something, Citi-Shakti, there has been too much of a mess. Look how many years and how many things have happened. When is the clear up going to happen? I think this is the question that devotees are asking now and will be asking. I really do think that leaders who abuse others need to be held accountable. They need to be reprimanded. They need to be removed from their position, because they're going to be exposed to more vulnerable devotees that they will continue to abuse because that's habitual for them. So more abuse continues. And then secondly, it teaches other potential abusers that, you know what, you can do what you want and nothing will happen.
100%.
They have their followers and they will then become abusers, and it just becomes a culture. And
when I say make a mess, what I mean is, I'm not talking about mess as in let the abuse happen. What I'm saying is the mess of actually exposing it, because that's messy. Because I'll be honest, these, you know, we've both been around a long time. How often have these conversations happened publicly?
Yeah,
they haven't. They've happened behind closed doors. They happen in
people. Sorry, I'm getting passionate now.
but somehow I'm very passionate about this too, but I'm just trying to be realistic about where we are at now. I feel like us opening things up publicly, it's only just happening now. It's only started happening in the last few years. It's only in the last few years people are addressing things like mental health, the quality of relationships, abuse, and saying, okay, let's actually first of all even acknowledge that's actually happening, and it's not happening just in one little part of the world or happened only in the 90s. It happens still now.
Yeah. And the thing is that people, I think devotees don't talk about it publicly because they don't want to criticize. They don't want to commit offenses. It's, you know, there's this battle that happens internally for a lot of devotees with that. It's like, but, you know, this happened and this happened, this happened. But, you know, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to commit an offense. And they become resentful and it just festers. And so I think, you know, I just want to quickly say something on that, which is, pointing out reality and pointing out someone's nature, going back to the snake example, a snake is a poisonous snake, a snake is a snake, is a snake is a snake.
It's a snake.
Just acknowledging it and saying what's black is black and white is white is not committing an offense, right? When you want to point out a nature of something, actually that's applying your intelligence. You know, it's where you like a great example of an offense, you know, stories in Shastra is like Daksha with Lord Shiva. You know, you just, you know, you see something external and you see one little thing and then you just, you know, criticize the person as the individual that they are, and without looking at the whole thing. But you just say something about what's happening in reality as a problem and you want to find a solution, that's okay.
Yeah.
But in confidence, as in like you must have people you trust you can go to. That's got to be there. Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to say that I also have sometimes problems with accepting things because by profession I am a lawyer. I mean, more working at the court, but I specialize in human rights and humanitarian law and so on. So for me also some things that happen is like, well, in a normal society, people and society deal with it in this way. So why don't we deal with it like that? Because that's actually normal. Why are we pretending to be something that I don't know, pretending to be sometimes? I mean, if someone commits a crime, then you file a complaint with the police and then the society deals with it because we live in this society. So that's like normal stuff. But sometimes I feel I'm using ISKCON just because we are devotees in ISKCON. So we are talking about our spiritual community. Of course, there is a lot of problems in others, but I just don't understand why we are living somewhere else, in some other world, you know, and these rules don't apply to us, which in normal society they do. And also like I would also like to say that it doesn't mean that we don't have the compassion towards the abuser, or that we don't want to help him to change, or that we don't want to, I don't know, facilitate his spiritual life. Everything can be done, but there is a certain consequence. I mean, that's, you know, that's my contribution.
Yeah. Criminals go to prison for rehab.
Yeah.
You know, stay at home for the rehab. You know, it's this is the thing. Yeah, I agree. I think there need to be repercussions, and I don't think we're strong enough on the repercussions. And I think there's institutional fear of losing function and resource if people are brought to task, and I think that needs to be called out as well. That it all ends up, all that fear just ends up permeating everywhere, and then they have control because everybody's scared. Look what I'm worth to you. Look what I've done for you. You remove me, you will lose all of that.
And maybe like the fear that maybe people will lose faith in something like that happens in a spiritual society where everyone has to be perfect or whatever, pure devotees. I mean,
Well, sometimes people need a reality check. We're living in a human world. Human things will happen.
Yeah.
You know, you can't hide it from people. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist or a spiritualist, there's abuse around. It doesn't matter if you're a spiritualist, if you're an atheist, there's politics around. Why? Because these are all born of false ego. These are all born of transient ego. At least we have a solution.
Yeah.
You know, so let's take
actually holding an abusive person accountable will also, in one sense, it will reduce their karmic effect. If they're held accountable and they're given the right punishment, then that's good for them. You know, they will suffer less in the future. If you really want to, you know, protect the abuser, you know, give them what, you know, really is due. And yeah, you know, and the other perspective is as well that they are following their dharma. Like we all have a, you know, like I was saying, snake is a snake. The snake's dharma is to be poisonous and slither around.
Yeah, and
certain individuals that are, you know, have this psychological nature, they're meant to be this way in this life until they, you know, have the agency to change that. And so we just have to name it. We just have to be real.
Yeah. I just wanted to add just one. I mean, we cannot know what the internal motivation of someone saying something is, but as I understood, and especially because of the lectures of my spiritual master, His Holiness Niranjana Swami, he's into devotee care and everything, and he would always say that Vaishnava Aparada means that there is some envy also in us, which means that we have some malice towards the person. So that's what makes the aparada an aparada, because we want to harm a person because of something and so on, some certain envy. But just as you said, like if we name a snake because snake is poisonous and we say that it's poisonous, or like Srila Prabhupada would use an example of that the thief is a thief. If he stole something, he's a thief. Then there's no malice. It's just a fact. This happens.
Yeah. But just because someone's a thief, it doesn't mean you don't trust that Krishna can come through them. What you do is you just don't leave your handbag open around them. You know, it's if you recognize that. So someone may be abusive, that doesn't mean they're not good at anything else.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? They're awful with close, intimate relationships, but they may be amazing at raising money and building a temple. You know, so this is the thing, this understanding people's vulnerabilities and getting them help with that, but requires calling out first. And then you can make better use of their strengths. Reduce their karma, but reduce their Vaishnava Aparad. And also, you know, when we keep leaders in these positions, we not only poison the community, but remember, whatever suffering or whatever a leader does to their dependents, they have to take 1/6 of the collective karma. So if by their example, others are becoming exploitative, they also have to carry that load. And there's no getting away from it. You can cheat other people. You cannot cheat Krishna.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, and equally, if we're sincere and honest, other people may perceive us in a particular way, but Krishna knows exactly what our intention is. I'm just saying that we don't have to be limited by our karma. We're backed up by the source of everything. And so please don't feel that, oh, because I didn't have this or I didn't have that or I don't have it. You can have anything you want. Just allow Krishna to work with your intelligence. So I just wanted to just give that encouragement to devotees. You know, you're backed up. You can get out.
So the last question I would like to ask, and then we can finish slowly, is that, like, is there a hope for an abuser to change? And if someone finds themselves abusing others, what can they do to change their behavior? So what can we do to help them, and how can they help themselves?
Chaitanya-Lila, do you meet many abusers who actually come to you for help?
Some. I would say that I can kind of say what my perspective is professionally and experience. The more entrenched the psychological issues are, I'm talking about with the abuser. So if we look at it as a scale, so if somebody has a more entrenched personality disorder, so we're talking about full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, I've experienced that they're less likely to fully, properly engage in therapy because of what we described. It's just so hard to break down these constructs. And so often those types of individuals have come to therapy because they're in a very low place. They've either, like, all of their mechanisms of manipulating others has just failed and they just don't know where to go. They don't know, they're kind of grappling. And so they're kind of quite collapsed in their sort of sense of self, and they're very low, and questioning sort of themselves. But often they're trying to use therapy in order to get back, this status, this platform in which they can then function in that dysfunctional way. And so in my experience, it doesn't always last. They often, like, either disengage, kind of disrupt my relationship with them, and it kind of becomes a conflict that they find very difficult to, it's very difficult. So I think from that angle, when it's very, very entrenched on personality disorder level, it's very difficult for them to change, because it's just so hard for them to look at themselves in an honest capacity, and that's because it's hard for them to look at their pain. And then on sort of maybe the less entrenched scale, I think it is. I think that I like to hold the view as a therapist that anyone can change. It really depends on them. It really depends on them and their ability and their time in their life. And so, yes, I think abusive people are able to change their behaviors and their ways, but I've always said that it really depends on whether they're honest and they're able to show genuine self-reflection of the harm that they've caused. If you see that, that's a really good indicator that they're at a place where they're able to change themselves, because they're kind of able to hold their hands up and say, honestly, I have impacted that person. And so they're not coming to therapy, they're not wanting to change because they feel bad or they've been caught, right? They're wanting to change because they really genuinely are able to show empathy for that other person and able to see, I impacted them. And that's a really good place that person can start. And then, from there, being able to honestly look at oneself and then start to change. Okay, I'm doing this. What do I need to do differently? I'm thinking in this way, or I'm reacting in this way. Then what do I do? So if they can really step into that place of wanting to change, and they're invested and they're committed, yeah, I think people can change.
I think, as well as where they lie on the spectrum in terms of how deeply the dysfunctional constructs are embedded in their mind, is also how early things are caught, or not even caught, but how quickly and how early on they get that insight. So again, this is why it's, even as somebody who's on the receiving end of abuse, the earlier you call it out, the sooner you give that person an opportunity to not become a slave to their dysfunctional patterns. And while it's still raw and young and it's soft clay, maybe they've only just started expressing that side of themselves. And so there's a real opportunity to change, because help is there. We understand so much more about these things now. And yeah, like anything, if you want to remold it, do it while it's still soft, do it in the early stages. And relationships can be helped, relationships can be saved, relationships can go to a healthy place, but also having the honesty to know when there's not much more you can do. So yeah, don't wait. It's if there's a red flag, either you recognize it in yourself or someone else, just raise it early. You may be saving many more people than you realize. But yeah, please don't lose hope, whether it's the abuser or the person who's on the receiving end. Things can change, and they will change. It's inevitable.
And maybe just one more question: how can the community help? Because I know we have to find people with to whom we can disclose our minds, and these things are confidential. But maybe, like, I was always thinking, like, education of the community about these things, talking about these things, like that can maybe make a person braver to come up with these things and so on. So what do you think? Like, how do you see this, like the spiritual community helping, especially because we have this beautiful philosophy that actually can really change everyone's life?
Open door, open mind, and an open heart. Be willing to receive and be at everyone's service, even if it means your service is to draw out their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, and the things that they need to work on. Because if they know you're coming from a loving place, they're often willing to have a mirror held up to show them their most difficult and perhaps ugly side. And they're willing to look at it because they know the person holding up the mirror cares about. But yeah, that's in a nutshell. And then that will lead to so many things. You will see your role. Maybe your role is to help directly. Maybe your role is to signpost. Maybe your role is to have an influence on leadership and management. Maybe you're helping one particular individual. The ins and outs of it are different for different people. But I genuinely believe if we have an open door, open heart, and open mind, then we can really be an instrument for change.
Chaitanya-Lila, would you like to add something?
I think that we can all try and be just more friendly in the society, in the community. I think I witness and I see a lot of like unfriendliness, a lot of his hostility. I think people are just struggling with life, and people can become disgruntled. And I think that then closes walls, like Citi-Shakti is saying about like openness. And we need to be more open. We need to say, okay, how are you doing? And in being more inviting to allow people to have channels of being able to open one's heart and open one's mind. And so that's very small. It's a very small thing, but just having more personal
kindness
exchanges.
It's really beautiful. Thank you. That's how people know that you have an open heart and mind, is you can be kind no matter what. Everyone's trying. Everyone's trying, especially these days. Just everybody's working hard to stand still, and just as a friendly smile, it never goes to waste. Thank you. That's really nice.
Thank you very much for everything you contributed to this topic. I think it's very important. I'm very happy that, just to repeat for our audience, that in February 2020. GBC adopted a global policy against domestic abuse, where it clearly stated that it's not supporting it, it defined it, and also gave certain instruction or advices of how the victims can handle it in their communities, what to do, and also an indication for abusers that they should seek help. Thank you for contributing to this topic. It was really lovely to speak with you. I know that everything we touched upon, we could have talked much more and go even deeper, but maybe this will happen in the future, in some future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hare
Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.